This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, November 11th, 2024, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. As you know, Donald Trump is headed for a second term in the White House. The pundits have had ample opportunity to dissect the political implications of his victory. For this week's edition of the podcast, we wanted to explore the potential financial repercussions of a new Trump administration. There's no mystery, for example, about his fondness toward tariffs, the taxes applied by the government for imported or exported goods as a way to influence foreign trade. Trump once referred to himself as tariff man and has enthusiastically proposed a 10 to 20% tax on most foreign products and a 60% tariff on goods from China. On the American front, he wants to lower corporate taxes and extend the tax cuts from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that are set to expire soon. His administration is widely expected to loosen corporate regulations and otherwise defang watchdog agencies. He's seen as a devoted friend of the financial, defense, and crypto sectors. Wall Street was thrilled with his election victory. The stock market almost literally jumped for joy on November the 6th, posting some of the biggest gains seen in many months. Trump's policies will affect us, street-level consumers and investors, in direct and indirect ways, some intentional and perhaps some unintentional. IBJ financial columnist Peter Dunn, a.k.a. Pete the Planner, is our guest this week to help us make sense of what could be in store for us, the stock market, the federal debt, the economy, and inflation over the next 4 years. The tariffs, in particular, could be problematic for some American industries, including the automobile sector, and could have the effect of boosting inflation. Pete also suspects that the pharmaceutical industry could have a tough time, which might affect Indianapolis-based Eli Lilly and Company. A quick bit of context. Our conversation was taped on Thursday, November the 7th, so we don't note the Federal Reserve's decision to continue lowering interest rates that was announced later in that day. Without further ado, here's Pete. I'm pleased to welcome back to the podcast Peter Dunn, a.k.a. Pete the Planner. Thank you for making time. I assume that you have been keeping busy.
Oh, yeah. Slow news week last couple of weeks, so not much to do other than stare at the markets and the economy and projections of what is next. From trick or treats to trick or tariffs, this episode. I don't know. I've been working on that. Do you like it?
Thank you for preparing that one for me.
Anytime.
Yeah, I woke up on Wednesday and apparently former President Trump is future President Trump.
Yeah. So here's what you can expect from me today on the show. No political opinions, because you really shouldn't care what I think.
Thank you.
I will give some expert guidance on the economy. I will give some opinion, and then I will give some expert opinion. And those are three very distinct things. And I will let you know my best when I'm doing which.
Let's do the stock market first, because I understand that the best. So, okay, Trump will be sworn into office on January 20th, but the stock market immediately reacted to the election. Big leaps on Wednesday across all the major indexes, and I'll take them for a quick spin. Dow Jones up 3.6%, S&P 500 2.5%, NASDAQ nearly 3%, and the Russell 2000, my favorite index, just because it's so random, nearly 6%. So, the financial press, very predictably says, well, investors appear to be anticipating big gains under Trump. Why?
Well, because the economy is going to grow quite a bit, right? I sent out an email to our staff here at my business on Monday morning prior to the election. And I said, the market is going to do something pretty wild this week, depending on who wins. And while making a past prediction sort of weird, I will say I knew that if Trump was elected, we'd be in this position that we are today. And I also feel had Vice President Harris been elected, I think that would have been reflected in the market negatively, because it would have meant to those on Wall Street slower periods of economic growth. So Mason, at its essence, this says a bunch of people are about to make a bunch of money, and the market was signaling that.
So the argument that I hear is Wall Street believes Trump will bring corporate tax cuts and looser regulation. But what I'm hearing from you also is they're expecting greater economic growth.
Yeah, with less regulation, with lower interest rates, you're going to see certain industries, which we can talk about, just absolutely thrive. Like all the restraints are off and it's pedal to the metal. Other industries, while not necessarily targeted by policy, will be negatively impacted by what's ahead. But I can note this. Here's the strangest part about this. And I'm going into expert opinion territory here, okay? You're going to see low interest rates for a while. Okay? You just are in decreasing interest rates. But what you are likely to see, in my opinion, as soon as late next year, is you're going to see inflation tick up again for several reasons. The tariffs alone, I don't know whether to say proposed tariffs, threatened tariffs, promised tariffs. There's tariffs. President Trump has said it's his favorite word in the English language, which mine is tertiary. No one cares.
I remember Trump called himself Tariff Man.
Yes, I am not tertiary, man, although I often did get bronze medals in youth swimming. The challenge to this is that the stock market's going to keep going up. I'm just telling you, that's my opinion. I think, and don't act on that, by the way. That's not investment advice. It's going to keep going up. You're going to see businesses borrow at low rates and grow. They won't have to worry about regulation. You're going to see mergers and acquisition activity pick up again because of this deregulation. You're going to see a hot stock market. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the consumer is going to benefit from that. Unless you're participating aggressively in the stock market, sometimes you don't get to participate in the economic growth. And Mason, a few times ago when I was on, we talked about the vibe session. You introduced me to that phrase, the vibe session. It's where the economy was actually fine.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Just so folks get this right. So it's not recession, it's a vibe session. That's
vibe session.
Context,
right. So here's the thing, and the numbers support this. The economy is actually fine right now. It just doesn't feel fine for a lot of people. So that's saying that the vibe feels bad.
Right.
I think what you're going to see is sort of a switch of that, is you're going to see the economy continue to be very strong and get actually stronger, but it's not going to be felt outside of consumer confidence because of inflation. You're going to see people have less buying power starting, I would say, 9 to 12 months from now.
Because inflation will start to tick up again.
Yeah, I mean, we're all experts on inflation now, so we know what that's like. It's an omelet is not $6, an omelet is now $11, right? One of those things.
Right.
And by the way, here's a prediction. You're not going to ever see prices come back down from inflation other than something like oil because of how those barrels are released and regulated. You're not going to see food prices come back down. They're ratcheted up and they're staying up. The question is, how long do they stay at this current level? And I'm saying about a year from now, I think they're going to have an increase as things like tariffs start to take hold.
Yeah, that was my question. Why does inflation necessarily tick up if the economy is going great, or are they interrelated?
There's a few different reasons. Let's talk about tariffs in that regard. So when we talk about tariffs for China, what we're trying to do is to create an imbalance so that American goods are less expensive. Now, here's the problem with that. And there's some good with it. I'm not here to say it's awful, but oftentimes those taxes, those additional costs are just passed right on to the consumer, right? It's like, well, we're still going to import it. That's still where I get my product. All of these products are not commodities in the sense, Mason, that you could go, oh, well, I'm just going to buy the American version. We're in a global economy. That just doesn't happen really as much as people used to think it did. Here's the other side. Let's say you're Ford and GM. You're a domestic car company, but some of your parts that you build your cars with are imported from China or imported from overseas with these tariffs. The cost of your production of your cars just went up, and you either pass it on to consumers, which then makes you at a competitive imbalance, or you eat it and your profitability comes down. So there's a lot of experts that feel like the domestic automobile industry is about to really struggle as a direct result of these tariffs.
And to give folks context on what Trump has said about tariffs, I think across the board, he said maybe 10 to 20% increase in the cost of getting those products here to America. Though if it's coming from Mexico or China, it could be as much as 60%.
Yeah, that's a lot. And the thing about tariffs, the consumer eats the cost or the importer eats the cost. And I'm telling you, importers are not going to eat the cost. They're just going to pass it on to consumers. And that's why you're going to see this inflationary environment. And I, just so you know, for whatever it matters to anybody, I'm not saying that critically. That's just how it works.
And just real quick, just a little extra context on tariffs from the mind of Donald Trump. He believes, or says he believes, these tariffs will create more jobs in America, will help shrink the federal deficit, will help lower food costs, and allow the government to subsidize childcare. Obviously there is a rationale for doing this, or at least a stated rationale. I don't know how realistic you think that is.
For every piece of major economic policy, whether it would have been for former, now future President Trump, I don't even know what you call it, former, now future President Trump, or Vice President Harris, no matter what their economic policy was, it's not unidirectional, right? It's not all good. There is good and bad that comes with all of it. So the tariffs should create a proper balance in trade. They should. I don't buy that it brings down childcare and food costs and all those different things, because we're not just importing finished product, we're importing parts. And then that's where inflationary challenges can come. And I will also say, and we haven't talked about tax cuts a lot yet, major tax cuts coming, major, which can also lead to inflation. This is where you try your best to think back to high school economics, and you start to look at the relationships. If you do this, it does this. But then you realize what your high school econ teacher told you is it's actually just a circle, right? And this leads to this, and then you're back to the start. So what you're going to see is tax cuts, people theoretically having, certain groups of people having more money to spend. And then at that point in time, what you're going to have is price increases, and then we're right back to inflation.
Okay. And while we're talking about tax cuts, for sure, Trump wants to extend the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was one of his signature pieces of legislation and accomplishments, which I think are supposed to expire in 2025. He wants to obviously continue those into, I'm not sure how far into the future, but definitely wants to. And then in addition to that, is interested, I think, in reconstructing the tax code.
That's interesting. So two elements. Let's talk about the two elements of the things you just said there. The extension of the tax cuts. Whether you think those are good or bad, or whether a listener thinks those are good or bad, we've all been living those. Not only in the Trump presidency, we're living it right now. And so the extension of them won't feel like a material difference. Again, not criticism. That's just a concept of inertia, right? It's going to be the same thing. Now, in terms of revising the tax code, I think literally everyone in the country wants a revised tax code. I also find it one of those things that we all agree with, but the application of change is so unbelievably difficult. That would be an impossibility. And I guess is the best way for me to say that. I think the thing we haven't talked about here too, and President Trump didn't talk a lot about it during his campaigning, and I have to say I didn't watch a lot of his speeches, but in reading about them, he didn't talk a lot about reducing the deficit. If you're going to cut taxes, then you're cutting a source of tax revenue for the government who has exorbitant amounts of bills. I also don't know what to believe in terms of what government programs and agencies are getting cut and taken away forever. And it's not for me to wax poetic on that. All I can say is, Mason, if you're doing tax cuts and you are eliminating these agencies, we're still going to be stacking trillions and trillions of dollars in debt because of things like the tax cuts. And to be fair as I can, the deficit would have continued to skyrocket had Vice President Harris been put into office. So there's certainly difference in their economics policies, but the output's the same, is that the deficit is going to continue to grow. And it's what's, if we're going to talk, oh, the market went bonkers and One of the strangest things on Wednesday, the day after Election Day, Mason, was that a bunch of people who didn't vote for Trump or didn't want him to become the next president opened up their brokerage statements or checked their balances, and they were met with, I know you didn't want this, but this is the best day you've had in the market in 2 years. And that's the ultimate sweet salt to wounds. I don't know. It's kind of a strange thing that happened.
Yeah, well, the first year of the Trump administration, I believe they called it the Trump bump. The market did incredibly well. And over the course of his administration, I believe the S&P went up 65, in the mid 60% over the 4 years.
I have 57, but maybe mine's not with dividends. And then so far in the Biden administration was 70. Now here's because we're all looking for humor right now. And we're also looking for nerd humor. So this is a doubler for you people out there. Mason, the funny part about this is Biden is going to get credit under his presidency for what happened on Wednesday, the day after Election Day, when the annals of history are written. And I don't know why I think that's funny. It's primarily because I'm a nerd. That's why I think it's funny.
I think that's really an appropriate nerd joke to make. Yeah, I mean, we have to take these numbers with, truckfuls of salt, because, so many things happen that are outside of the president's control. Somewhere in the Trump administration, obviously, we had a pandemic, at least the start of one. If we wanted to go back to he started off his administration with an unprecedented terrorist attack and then ended it with a nearly unprecedented depression. Take these numbers with a giant chunk of salt, folks.
I do think if you go election to election, I find this interesting. I can go back to the first Clinton administration, okay? Election to election, when he was elected for the first time to the time he went up for re-election or a new election took place. His first term, S&P 500 went up 70% during that term. Second term, it went up 101%. Bush's first term, it went down 21%. Bush's second term, it went down 11%. Now, I'm going to time out here because, Mason, you just said it. You have to add the context of the times in here. You have to add in 9/11, the housing market meltdown. And while it's certainly fun to assign those sorts of things to a president if you don't like them, it's not exactly fair. Obama, first term, up 42%. Second term, up 50%. Trump, first term, up 57%. And like I said, Biden's first and only term just ended at up 70%. I don't know. It's fascinating to me.
Maybe the best way to utilize these figures is just to give them to the people who think, hey, this is the beginning of a new presidential administration. There's going to be a lot of change. There's a lot of stuff here that I can't control. I'm just going to take my money out of the market, or I'm going to realign my investment somehow. Maybe because politically I don't like the guy in the White House, or maybe just I'm scared. And it seems to be the argument we always make when we get together. Taking your money out of the market is a very bad idea.
Yeah, you can throttle your exposure. It's a pretty fun clinical term. You can throttle your exposure to the market while still staying in the market. And that's generally the more prudent thing for a person to do. I would love to chat about, though, what industries are poised to go bananas under policy and which ones are going to in turn suffer if you're up for it.
Let's go.
All right. So the energy sector, fossil fuels, here we go. Right? Like we're going to see more domestic energy sources. So I think you're going to see companies that mine or frack, I don't know the verb, energy here domestically. You're going to see significant increases in share price, including ExxonMobil. By the way, also disclaimer, none of this is investment advice. Don't start with that, pal. It's not investment advice.
Let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ podcast. In my interview with Pete the Planner about the potential financial impact of a second Trump administration.
Mason, a topic that has been talked about a lot in the last, 15 years, renewable energy. You're going to have some challenges here. The EPA goes away and all these different things. Renewable energy companies are going to have a really hard time turning a profit. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it may just be a reality.
I think there's widespread belief that the EPA will be neutered in some fashion, if not completely done away with. And I think you probably would have to help me with the verbiage here. But yeah, within the last probably 2 years, the administration passed legislation that really encourages investment in green energy, green jobs, stuff like that. And you would assume that that would basically fall off the radar screen on the Trump administration.
I would see the tax cut. This is a total opinion, not expert opinion. I would think the tax favorability elements that exist for things like electric vehicles, you could see those change. Although one of my predictions and thoughts here is, and this is as cynical as I'm probably going to sound today, if I'm being honest with myself, is that I think you're going to see pro Elon Musk policies. And again, I'm sorry, I didn't want to say it. I just think it to be true. And so that's to say, it makes sense. I mean, I don't think even the staunchest supporter of President Trump will say to me, there are not going to be pro Elon Musk policies that benefit him financially. I think everyone can probably agree with that. Some people have no problem with it, and some people do, but I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, he's been widely to be on the list of major policy advisors for technology. If nothing else. If I'm a major policy advisor to the president, where I fancy myself a Ward Cleaver style ethicist, I'm not quite sure I could resist the self-dealing that would come with if I'm the CEO of several companies that with trillions of dollars at stake, Yeah. So maybe don't put me on the panel, President Trump. Next, the banking industry is going to go bananas, at least for a little while. Right? Just at least for a little while, you're going to see Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase with lower interest rates. And really, Mason, this is about deregulation. The more regulation there is in the banking industry, the harder it is to turn a buck. When the rules start going away, go figure, it's a little bit easier to squeeze out that EBITDA. So you're also going to see cryptocurrency rise. And we've already seen it rise a little bit. Although, anecdotally, and in my opinion, I thought it rose a little bit less than I thought it would on Wednesday, but I still think you could see it trickle up as Trump actually gets back into office. Yeah, I think Trump has been very bullish on crypto. He's touted plans on the campaign trail to make U.S. the, quote, crypto capital of the planet, unquote, and the Bitcoin superpower. And he promises to the industry that he will appoint a crypto presidential advisory council. He will fire security. What is it? What does SEC mean?
Security and Exchange Commission.
Yeah. He will fire Security and Exchange Commission Chair Gary Gensler, and he will create a strategic national Bitcoin stockpile.
You brought it up with the SEC head on the chopping block, according to President-elect Trump. I have a cynical prediction here. I think you're going to see an increase in fraud from financial advisors and stockbrokers during this period, because when the SEC has even less bite than it has now, then there's going to be no disincentive other than the greater good for malfeasance from financial experts. So there's a fun prediction. Broker check is about to blow up a little bit.
Okay. What other industries are you interested in?
Couple more. And by the way, when you say, am I interested in them, I'm interested in for the purpose of this.
Interested in speaking about.
Sure. Just bringing clarity. I think you're going to see the defense industry take off once again. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. That's not a big stretch. And so that's one. Now, here's one that I don't really love talking about. I don't. And it's not fun. I think you're going to see private prisons and correctional facilities become profitable, as I think there will be some increased level of incarceration. I mean, you can't really say you're the party of law and order and then have no outcome. Again, I'm not judging. I'm just saying, like, I that's the math, right? Is it not? And then technology, I think you are going to see, and not in a cynical way, the sort of technologies that like SpaceX bring along and NVIDIA and AI. I think you're going to see no regulation coming around AI, none. And so that will mean those companies will turn some pretty wild profits.
Any other companies that might, or industries that might suffer?
Renewable energy, the policy rollbacks, that's going to be a challenge. Automobile industry, for sure. I think Ford and General Motors are about to really struggle. And the rough part about that, too, is I think in terms of, I don't know the terms we use, blue collar workers, automobile workers, and their wages and their wage growth and their contracts. I think a lot of people who just stacked hands on this election are going to be negatively impacted financially there. And that's not to say they shouldn't have made the votes they made. I think not everyone votes according to their own economic interests. A lot of people vote against their economic interests knowingly or unknowingly. And who am I to judge? I think the biggest one that is going to have an impact potentially locally is you're going to see healthcare and pharmaceutical companies really face some rigor if the folks that are being bantied about as the head of the FDA and advisor on healthcare, if those things actually happen and the brakes are off, I think you could see a lot of pharmaceutical regulation and healthcare challenges there. So I think you could see those industries suffer a bit.
Now, for me as an investor, and I can only speak for myself, let's say I'm an investor 10 years away from retirement. Does my investing strategy need to change at all because of all this?
Is it unfair for me to say that's the best question you've asked me in about 50 interviews over the last few years? Because it makes it feel like by saying it that way, that all the other ones were trash, which they weren't. But that's an amazing question.
Okay, I will take it.
No. The answer is no. Like, that's the funny part about all of this.
See, I've been paying attention. You didn't think I was paying attention this whole time for the last 7 years.
Yeah, you should have a diversified portfolio. Yeah, you probably should have some financial services stocks in your portfolio that your financial advisor talks to you about. And you probably should have some energy sector stocks. You probably, if it fits with your ethos, have defense industry stocks in your portfolio. And by the way, do you trim back on some other stuff? Yeah, but this is all cyclical. It's not like the next 4 years are locked in for all of eternity. I just don't believe that to be the case. So it shouldn't really change much.
I mean, you've done a wonderful job of making sure people don't take your predictions as investment advice, though I'm sure that there'll be people who, they can pretty much read in any financial publication to know that banks are going to do better. They're going to do well. Invest in banks. I mean, is that a great idea for me just to go, oh, okay, great. I'll take the 5 banks that I know the best, and I'm going to throw a bunch of money in there.
It may be not that easy, but I would say it should spur a conversation with your financial advisor. I'm always going to lean towards that. I'll say this, though, Mason, too. Your podcast, the Indianapolis Business Journal, tries to serve everyone. The reality is you have a demographic of listeners and readers. And for everything I've said today is incredibly applicable to all of those people. So that's to say, most people's financial plan did not change on Wednesday morning at 2 a.m. Most people in this country, your financial plan did not change, including a vast majority of your listeners and readers. So this is sort of parlor conversation, if nothing else. I will note, and I wanted to say this because I knew we'd be together today, and this is hardcore opinion, and it's not political. It's financial opinion. The grossest financial element of the campaign cycle, other than all of the money donated to both campaigns, is the futures market, where people could go to places and bet on with financial future contracts of who the president was going to be. These were not gambling sites. These were futures contracts traded through financial platforms. There were commercials all over the radio about trading. I'm like, guys, that is gambling. That is not investing. And that disgusts me as much as anything. I just think that is such a backwards move from the financial services industry to do something like that.
When you're talking about the gambling thing, my mind goes to my now young adult aged nephews who I think are pretty enamored of the betting websites for sports. And it kind of bums me out that, we have this culture of gambling that now apparently extends to like literally any aspect of American life, including who the president's going to be.
I'm with you there. I mean, if you want to talk about the oldest of fuddy-duddies, it's me. I think gambling culture is pervasive in the markets today and in the platforms that try to take advantage of people who are addicted to gambling.
Well, shoot. Where do we go from here?
Well, here's where we go. Here's where I think we are 4 years from now. I think the stock market has gone up quite a bit. And I'm also going to make absent any wild world events. Okay. So like, I'm not making any predictions there. I'm not my lane, man. But let's say in a vacuum, I think you're going to see significant stock market growth in line with what we've seen in the last administration, which was 70% in 4 years. It's really good. You're going to see that. I think it's going to be front loaded though too, Mason. I think you're going to see earlier gains, and then you're going to see the economy with inflation start to slow back down. You're going to see it's going to get overheated. And you may even see Fed policy try to step in near the end of the Trump presidency and reel it back in if it gets too out of control. The weird part about that is if the president chooses to change how the Fed works, then those guardrails may not be there. I also think what you're going to see is incredibly low tax rates for a portion of the population. And then the people that maybe don't have some of those tax breaks really impacted by inflation. But again, I don't say that in an accusatory way. I just that's what I think is going to happen. Before Inauguration Day, we should check in. So right in the middle of January, I think would make some sense, honestly. And then thereafter, the wheels of government either got to start turning or start slowing down. It would depend on how you look at that. Probably 3 months after that. And then that's when we'll really know what's going to happen, I think.
That's good. I appreciate the direction. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for all the work and all the information. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
My thanks again to Pete the Planner. A quick reminder, his column on personal finance appears regularly in the print edition of IBJ, and you can find several years' worth of his work at ibj.com. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's edition of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, for Indianapolis, staging the World Food Championships might sound like a bit of a lark after the NBA All-Star Game, the U.S. Olympic swim trials, and Taylor Swift. But you should think of the Food Championships as the Culinary Olympics. Dave Lindquist examines the potential local impact of hosting 1,200 chefs from more than 30 countries. Also in this week's IBJ, Daniel Bradley explores how Fishers officials hope to revitalize the Allison Road commercial corridor. And we highlight the professional, civic, and philanthropic achievements of attorney Melissa Proffitt, the recipient of this year's Michael A. Carroll Award. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. And I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to ibj.com, click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.